G'day mate, it's me, Willie, the Tapwise Owl. Down under, we've got a cheeky little game called 2 Facts and a Fib. Reckon you can spot the porky? Number 1, before hitting record, Andrew swore blind that this was a ripper idea and that my true blue Aussie accent would be a smash hit with all you crafty beer professionals on the YouTubes. Number 2, Tapwise makes it dead easy to run your beer club and bring your mates back to the bar with your very own branded brewery app. Monthly subs are a breeze, perks and rewards tick along on autopilot, and the cash lands in your bank account every night, you business legend. Number 3, in the past year, breweries have pulled in nearly 100,000 extra chatroom visits and raked in over $1 million in recurring revenue with apps of their own. Got the fib? Right, mate. Andrew reckoned this was a bugger idea, but joke's on him. I went and did it anyway. So book a demo today and let's show Andrew you're keen on packed tap rooms, steady revenue, and of course me, Willie, the Tapwise Owl. Cheers, Cobber. Now enough chin wag. Let's get on to the learny bit.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Glad you could join me. Today, we're going to look at some talent trends. In particular, we're going to look at some of the challenges we're facing right now in this talent space, or another less fancy way to say that is to look at the employee space. And really what I want to do is not only look at the problems, but let's try to find some solutions through the lens of how we engage with our employees and by extension, how we work as leaders to do that most effectively. So we'll get some of the preliminaries out of the way. My name is Steve Hopkins. I'm a director at an organization called Wipfli. Wipfli, I'll introduce here in a moment, but within that organization, I'm focused on our all matter of things people development. And that really boils down to being a conversation around the attraction, retention, and development of people, and with a particular focus around leadership development, since leaders have a disproportionate or should have a disproportionate weight around the impact they have on talent, both the attraction, retention, and certainly on the developmental aspects of our employee base. So it's also where our executive coaching practice sits, as well as any number of small individual and team-based practices that we have. With respect to Wipfli, it's a family name, but it has been around for 130 years. We are a huge top 25 accounting firm with a sizable business consultancy where I sit. And as you can see from either cursory glance at the slide deck, we are so many things that Wipfli does. So the intention here is really to position ourselves as your thought partner. If there are aspects of your business that you want to discuss, whether that's fractional outsourcing, you need HR help, you need CIO support or a CFO support, you need data analytics, cybersecurity, you name it, we've got specialists to help with that. And we're, what can I say? We're Midwest nice. So by all means, please reach out. We'd love to have that conversation with you. So with the advertisements out of the way, let's really get to the objectives today. And is typical of me. I'm sure I have more content than I have time to do it. So I'm going to talk fast, but I want you to feel free to use the chat if that's convenient, ask questions, and certainly at the end of this, I'll provide information around connecting with me. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to be able to present some additional resources or help you in any way I can. But really, today's focus is on helping us to understand really what are the challenges we're facing today. Let's be thoughtful about what the disruptors are in the marketplace. And a big part of that is demographic in nature, meaning that we've got seismic shifts going on in demographics, both in terms of the population of employees that we have to work with, as well as that generational divide, right? And differences in multiple generations that are part of the workforce. From that, we've got some challenges then around engagement. We've never had the kind of trouble we have today around an engaged workforce. And that really leads us to the last phase of this, which is a leadership and maybe more generally a people conversation. What are some of the practices that we really need to be thoughtful of in generating the right kinds of engagement and the right kinds of development for employees so that they are maximally impactful and they're here for the long run. They're here as retained employees that we can depend on and develop to help our business grow. So with that in mind, let's start to dive into this. So the first part of this, as I say, is really this conversation around disruptors. And it's a big conversation. There's a lot of disruptors going on. So I'm sure I've not cataloged everything that we could possibly bring in here, but part of the focus is certainly on this talent shortage. So we simply do not have enough working age individuals to meet the talent demand that we have out in the workplace. And that's exacerbated further by differences in the generational workforce and areas of focus. So it is true that industries that attracted boomers don't necessarily attract millennials, who don't necessarily attract Gen Z, and so on and so forth. Beyond that, we've also got more of a globalized workforce now. We've got such an openness and sort of bidirectional communication with respect to workers and employment opportunities, limited though they may be in instances, that we're competing in silos that heretofore we never would have competed in, or competed with is probably a better way to say that, right? So we've got labor dispersed differently than it was historically. And that also ties into this value shift. So I've mentioned it several times, this generational difference. We have 4 generations in the workforce right now, and the value shift is tangible. There are just real differences in how those different generations think about what it means to be an employee, what work looks like, what work-life balance looks like, et cetera. I've also tried to catalog a range of items that I've called here the unexpected, but these are asymmetrical issues that we're facing. And largely by this, I mean to capture things that are frankly beyond our control. There are just certain things that we as individuals can't control. They're part of either the national or maybe even global conversation. You need to be thoughtful about that. And this kind of leads us to this last phase, 5, the unprepared leadership. Another way I might have said this is, what does it mean for leaders to be prepared? What do we have control over as leaders such that we can retain employees, we can develop them, and start to offset some of the things that maybe we don't have as much control about, right? So let's get real thoughtful and specific around those things we can control, even as we try to recognize and deal to the best of our ability with areas that we don't have that level of control. I'll take a breath. How's that? And we'll get into the first part of this, which is demographics. And this is a really interesting segment insofar as the data suggests, and I'm going to use a word that I'm sure I'll probably regret doing this given the current climate, but this is as factual as I know how to be. This is as close to an unmitigated, unbiased fact as I can create for you. There's simply not enough labor to meet the demand that we have. Birth rates have been falling for decades. There's a huge difference between boomer population and Gen X, and now by extension millennial. And there's simply not enough working age individuals to meet demand. Now, granted, we have other factors at play here too. We don't know what the rise of AI is going to do when we look at labor demand more generally, but it is nevertheless a fact, irrespective of that we don't have a labor pool sufficient to meet historical demand. And here's another slide that really shows that simply through a different lens, but you'll notice a fairly precipitous drop from boomer to millennial. And yet again, another way, right? Of the original 76 million boomers, only 39 million are still available to the workforce, and even all of them are not actively engaged as part of that workforce. Gen X, a member of which I claim to be a part, we're 20% lower in terms of our population count than boomers. So we've got this big divide between the boomer population as they exit and the Gen X, and by extension, millennials replacing those boomers. We look at this very concretely. It's now true that millennials make up the largest segment of the work population at 39%. That's followed by Gen X. I think the most interesting shift is between boomers and Gen Z. This is a relatively recent shift. I had data 18 months ago even that really had a much closer balance between boomer and Gen Z. So that data is changing really, really fast. It's now estimated that by 2030, that boomers will make up only 10% of the workforce, with the corresponding rise then in Gen Z filling that gap. So we've got 4 primary generations in the workforce today, and a rapidly rising younger population as part of our workforce who think differently about work-life balance, who have been influenced or developed through a different lens, right? You think about the historical impacts that kind of shape us as young adults. Think about those things that really have a measurable impact on our outlook on life, our outlook towards work, our outlook towards both the national and international audience. Seismic differences, and that's really changing the flavor of work within organizations as we see that generational divide start to play out. Take this one step further. This is some data that's looking at where millennials, I'm choosing millennials as the largest of our sort of employee bases, generationally speaking. I'm looking at where millennials are finding work attraction. What are they interested in? And even a cursory look at the slide is interesting and telling. Notice that something like 72% of their interest funnels into 3 primary areas. And I've got another slide for that. We can kind of call these out. So you've got hospitality, healthcare, and tech make up the balance. Historically, there was more interest in a wider range of association with, say, financial services, right? And that's a broad catch-all: banks, mortgage bankers, wealth management, private equity. There would have been a larger population percentage-wise in boomers and even X. So we're seeing a constriction in financial services. We're seeing a constriction in manufacturing. So you take an already difficult labor market and you exacerbate that by looking at where millennials are focused. Now, if there's a good side to this, when you think about brewing, there is a bigger interest from millennials and Zs in brewing and alcohol sales more generally. So you'll notice that a big part of that hospitality piece is bartending. Some additional numbers I think are interesting to kind of play that out. That's somewhat generic. But if you look at, there's a 32% today of millennials or make up our alcohol purchasing audience. So 32% of alcohol sales run through millennials today. Interestingly, though, there's also a decrease in the percentage of millennials purchasing alcohol. So with the rise of other kinds of beverages, whether that's non-alcoholic, whether that's hard seltzer, whether that's THC infused, right, or similar types of products, you're seeing a diversification of product that's lowering the amount of alcohol purchase that millennials are making. That said, they continue to make up the fastest growing trend in terms of actual employment within alcohol sales, alcohol manufacturing, and specifically within brewery or brewing more generally than their predecessors, Gen X. So let's talk a little bit about millennials for a second. And by extension, we can bring Gen Z. And this is where I would love to have a conversation, chat-based. I'd love to know what you're finding. The research suggests that you've got a very different value set. You've got much more intentionality around a work-life balance. So they're really interested and attracted to organizations where that work-life balance exists, where there is career pathing, there's articulation of what the future entails, there's active development. Okay, but that development is specific. It's not a sort of the classic leadership directorial model where I tell you what to do and you do it, but instead a more focus on a collaborative, almost a mentorship-based, or I say here a coach-based model of development. There's also a proclivity for transparency. So there is an openness around communication that can be a little bit off-putting, frankly, to boomers and those who had more of a sort of siloed mindset when you think about traditional roles within organized labor, when you think about labor execution. So it's a very different model, and it's changing again with Z, because we're going to do a disservice if we try to conflate millennials and Gen Z and say, well, younger generation, it believes X, Y, and Z. Sure, there are certain things that they share in common, but there are a lot of nuanced differences as well. So the outcome of all this is simply to say that we've got to be able to have conversations and think differently about the types of engagement that we're instituting in our organizations. That, again, the classic dictatorial model, the sort of leadership model that frankly came out of sort of military mode where, you do what I say, is no longer really meeting with validity in the same way that it historically has. There's more of a questioning around that type of approach and a more of a partnership model that we're looking to have. And that can be good and that can be challenging in some ways. But the only way to navigate it successfully is to be willing to have those conversations and lay out expectations in a reasonable and clear way. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. Before we do that, though, I'll note as part of that unexpected category, right, things that are largely outside of our purview right now. When you look at market contraction, you look at the impact of tariffs. I've even gone on here the impact from the government shutdown. When you look at certain initiatives that were underway, and I call out New Jersey for this, where there are changes being made from a legal standpoint within the industry that are now put on hold as long as this government shutdown continues, causing further delay in how we can affect change and maybe navigate some of the challenges that we are experiencing within the industry. And again, in the consumer behavior and distribution strategy, there is a marked change in the way that we're engaging with both our workforce and by extension with the consumer public. That proliferation of different solutions beyond traditional alcohol, the health concerns that millennials and Gen Z have. It's a different attitude and mindset around alcohol and a less of an attraction to alcohol than historically we saw with boomers or Gen X. And a move by, I think, compensation within brewery industry to look towards tap rooms and brew pubs, other more active ways of engaging with local community to draw in participants or draw in consumers and demonstrate an avenue for growth for the organization, as opposed to classic distribution models. So it's a lot of words even for me. So what do we do with all this? I mean, that's really at the end of the day, what are we saying? Well, we're saying we've got some challenges with labor, got not enough labor to meet all the demands that we have. Furthermore, depending on where we are industry-wise, we can have that further exacerbated in that we're not having an attraction to certain areas of, traditionally areas of industry or areas of business, market segment. And then we've got generational dynamics on top of that we have to navigate that really can make it confusing or difficult to figure out how to create mass appeal, target the attraction and retention and development of talent. To add one more piece to that, let's talk a little bit about engagement, because engagement is the other part of this. So you've got labor today, right? You've got an employee base. Are they engaged? Are they really fully engaged in the work that they have there? Do they see a pathway for further growth and development within the organization? Is it in their minds a temporary engagement, or are they willing to plant a flag and stay and be developed and become a long-term employee? The data is not great on this, meaning that if you look just at very general terms, we've got a rather surprisingly high number of disengaged employees in our workforce. Now, to be perfectly fair, that 66% really is a swath, right? So we're talking at the one end, those who are absolutely disengaged, full in, disengaged. They're punching the time clock to get a paycheck, and there's not much beyond that, up to moderately disengaged. So to be fair, that's a spectrum. About 17 to 18% are what I would really call fully disengaged. I mean, absolutely checked out. And that's consistent if you think of a bell curve, right? You think of 68%, the bell curve is in that middle, 16 to 17% respectively on either ends, or either highly engaged or completely disengaged. In this particular context, you've got a disproportionate amount there in that somewhat engaged, or conversely somewhat disengaged. And I think the other number that's challenging for me is that 52%, and I've seen this as high as 56%, are still actively looking for other roles, other jobs. So yes, they're enrolled today. Yes, there's some level of engaged or disengaged, but that the problem is that commitment isn't there. There's sort of a lifeline out there. Where else might I land? What else is out there that might be of interest to me? And that to me says something about the level of engagement. If I'm really satisfied in the role that I'm in, feeling that to be really engaging, I'm not looking for other employment. It doesn't mean if it comes to me, I'm not interested or open to it, but I'm not actively seeking. And that 52% is actively open to and looking for other places to be employed. And that's just concerning. The study that this comes from is from an organization called Gallup that does this on a regular basis. This is a huge survey. We'll look at the numbers in a moment, but it's a really well done survey, and it looks and maps levels of engagement tied to developmental impetus within an organization. Another way to say that is when organizations demonstrate really good leadership practices, it increases the engagement. And then there are outcomes from that are profitable for the organization. Those can be, and we'll look at them, increased profitability, better in overall engagement, higher customer satisfaction ratings, lower turnover, lower loss of productivity, for example. What you see on the screen is this hierarchy of what I would call engagement. At the top, growth, if you look at those incorporated or encompassed in the box, these are absolutely leadership capabilities. When you look about whether somebody is actively working with you from a developmental standpoint, are they asking questions about your development? Are they working to develop you? Doesn't get much more leadership oriented than that. And when you do that, you're creating tremendous engagement with that individual, right? That's a number one, top of the food chain engagement exercise, to be meeting with our direct reports regularly and to be actively interested in how they're doing and how to engage and develop them within role. And so all those items in the box really point to that. And what the ultimate consequence of that is when we get to better engagement, we get measurable improvement in the orientation of our business. We get improved profitability, productivity, lower turnover, and improved customer loyalty. And you can see from the engagement study, these are big numbers, huge number of organizations, global in its scope, 90 different countries, and a ton of employees, right? Over 3.4 million employees. So again, pointing to measurable impact when we're engaged from a leadership standpoint with our employee base. The outcomes from that are consequential. I also looked at a report from Zipdo. This is from 2025. It's looking at upskilling and reskilling within the beer industry specifically. You'll notice too that includes craft breweries of various sizes, and you've got different levels of leader as well as different levels of employee, different roles of the employee base. And again, you're seeing similar trending. When we're engaged in upskilling or developmental exercises, we're seeing increases in areas of our business we would want and hope to see. So a huge decrease in operational cost. There's an uptick in employment, which it correlates to that sales increase. So almost 40% of organizations that engage in upskilling saw a sales increase correspondingly, and overall employee engagement. Those numbers are huge. So a very long-winded way of saying that active engagement around development for our employee base increases net benefit to the organization on a number of different fronts, including sales, employment, and decreased operational cost. So the opportunity here then is to try to retain, grow, and by then extension, attract better talent. So retention is really the practice of development. We retain our employees by developing them. And this ties in nicely to the Millennial and Gen Z philosophy that, hey, if I'm going to be here, I want to know that I'm important and I got a career path here. What are you doing to increase my level of interest based on the time spent with me and the developmental pathway, career pathing that you're showing me? And that growth in employee capability also gets at some succession challenges, right? So we're plotting for the future. We're plotting for future growth. We're plotting for losing talent should it come, because we're doing improved employee. We're doing a better job with our employee base, developing them, making them more capable, and not only for what they do, but for increased complexity and role later on. And that actually has an attraction force as well. in this era of social media, believe me, it gets around when your organization takes time to develop and spends time investing in employees, in their personal growth, their development in the organization. This becomes an attraction strategy as well. And so we've got a market that's already problematic in terms of number of working age young adults that we have access to. Anything we can do to attract further talent can only help us in that capacity. So what does this look like? If we spend the remaining section of time really talking about what development looks like, how do we attract, develop talent? What does that leadership lens look like? If I can leave you with nothing else, one of the key points, development can be difficult. Almost everybody agrees we need to have some level of development. It's rare anymore that you find somebody who really is going to argue with you about the need for leaders to be developed and to be good, capable leaders. That seems somewhat common sense oriented. But where I think we do get into debate is, well, what kind of leaders are we developing? And to my mind, rather than get into a general debate around all the different avenues or facets that we can develop as leaders, the conversation is best set in asking a very basic question. Well, what do you need leaders to be able to do? What do they need to know in order to execute your business strategy? So if you've got a business strategy, and I think most organizations do, things that you're trying to accomplish, right, to improve or increase your business effectiveness, what do leaders need to know and be capable of doing to exercise that? That gives you that developmental trajectory, that pathway that you need for leaders. So instead of developing leaders just to develop them, pulling a list of competencies and sort of deciding that we need to develop across all of this range of different talents, what if we got really thoughtful and said, well, what is it they really need to know and be able to do to affect the right outcomes for the business? That becomes the lens through which we can talk about development. And it goes at a concept that I think doesn't get enough airplay, which is the distinction between leading and managing. Those terms are often used simultaneously, or not simultaneously, but used in the same breath. They're considered to be synonymous. But they really speak to two very different things. We talk about leading people and managing processes. So absolutely, we manage processes, and we all manage processes. But when we talk about people, it's a matter of leading, not managing them. And so that distinction then becomes paramount when we think about, well, what does it mean then to lead? What is leading all about? And for leadership to have efficacy in an organization requires an organizational-wide commitment. In other words, you can't have one or two individuals in an organization really interested in leadership and sort of off doing their own thing. It needs to be an organizational-wide concern. It needs to cascade down from the highest levels of leadership in the organization. It has to be noted that this is something we care about. It's not a one-off or individual leader, but something we as a firm, as an organization, believe in. It needs to be predicated on objective data. You make decisions around your business today based on data, and there's never been more data at your disposal. In that same breath, why wouldn't you make people decisions based on people data? There are a slew of tools out there that are now used for us to understand both performance and potential, so that when you think about hiring, think about onboarding, and then development, you think about the life cycle of an employee, you've got data at your disposal now to help you do that more effectively than ever before. Am I putting the right person into the right role? Do they have the characteristics behaviorally, temperamentally, cognitively, to be able to succeed in this role? Do they have those attributes that I would list as potential in terms of long-term development of goals and leadership potential for this individual in this organization? This data exists, and it's tremendously cost-effective. When you look at the cost of some of these evaluative strategies with respect to what it costs you to replace talent organization, it is a net positive equation by an exponential degree. So there is a lot of data out there to help us make smarter decisions. Beyond that, it also allows us to measure impact. I mean, if we're going to spend time developing, and that's going to be an organizational-wide commandment that we bring, right? We're going to exercise that commandment that leadership is important here, and we expect leadership performance accordingly. How do we know if it's working? What is the measurement? What are the KPIs that we use? It turns out that those KPIs also make for a great set of tools for evaluating talent on the front end. Do you have leadership competence coming into the organization? Are you a potential leader down the road? So we want to be able to measure that impact, and we want to ultimately create an environment, a culture in which we recognize the importance of leadership, and it is leader-led. It's reinforced from leaders. In other words, it's not a compliance culture where HR has to come in and say, now, did you remember to have those performance reviews? And did you remember to do X, Y, and Z around your leadership activities? But you're proactively doing that because that's what good leaders do. You're engaged in leadership activities that create meaningful outcomes for your direct reports, both in terms of their success and their long-term potential. I think it's also worth pointing out that leading is not intuitive. There's nothing intuitive about it. And I want you to take a minute and think about that. Why would I say that? Well, imagine you're 22, 23 years old, and you've really excelled as an individual contributor. And your leader comes to you and says, I want to promote you. I want you to step up and lead these team members. Okay. In the absence of training, in the absence of clear direction, your every instinct is to keep doing the things that you were successful with. That's what got you promoted. So this change in mindset that says, now that I'm a leader, I have to think differently about how I create value in the organization. The way I create value isn't as an individual contributor any longer, but as a leader through which work is accomplished. It's accomplished through the work of others, and it's through my direction, my enabling of their success and their development that allows for increased or magnified output, magnified production. So it's not intuitive. We have to shift our mindset. We also have to have a fair degree of self-awareness. Are we aware of the blind spots that we carry as leaders? Are we capable of being vulnerable as a leader? As somebody who says, hey, I don't have all the answers. Sometimes I don't know the answer, but I'm going to work with you to figure this out. I'm going to admit my mistakes. If I make a mistake, you're going to hear it. I'm going to raise my hand and demonstrate that action. So it becomes part of the culture of the organization. When mistakes are made, we acknowledge them and we learn from them, we grow from them, right? And ultimately, I think we do want to acknowledge that there are multiple facets to being an effective leader. There is leading people, and there's leading the business. Most of us, however, tend to think of leading the business as more of the traditional or formal way in which we demonstrate our leadership competence, our leadership effectiveness. And we miss that people component. That's really the part where the leader has the biggest impact. Because again, if you're not creating impact through your people, you're a glorified individual contributor. You're not really creating that magnification of effort, which goes from leading people effectively, making sure that they're doing a good job, ensuring that they're trained, they're developed accordingly, and they're executing the work, and there's accountability around it. So while there are both sides of the business, we need both those. We need to be able to lead the business effectively, right? There are functional aspects to our role. There are the people components, and the people components tend to be the more difficult and ultimately the areas of leadership that tend to get glossed over as we make our way up the ladder in more functional capacities. When we fail to define leadership, and we fail to practice leadership, there are any number of consequences from that. And this is really why I'm making such an advocacy for leadership and leadership effectiveness. So I'll point out just a couple and we'll keep moving, but when you fail to really support your team and to develop them, you're putting the organization at risk. There's a lot of conversation around succession and succession strategy, but honestly, if you're really engaged in an effective leadership practice, you're engaged in an effective succession practice. Because ultimately, succession is a story of how leaders in the organization will identify potential risks, identify potential candidates to fill that risk, and then train and develop those candidates to be capable of taking on that role when the time comes. That's a leadership activity. That role as a leader of developing my people, that's foundational leadership thinking. So the practice of leading has a tremendous impact in how we think about succession and really just performance overall. In the absence of leaders doing this work, who's going to do it? Do we expect HR to train and develop this group in our absence? It's fundamentally our role as leaders to take on that yoke and to do it successfully. And I'll note that it's not just about, again, the functional outcomes. There's a morale and an engagement factor here too. The more that I'm people invested, I'm spending time developing my direct reports, the more impact we get and the better performance we get overall. And when we fail to do that, when we either micromanage or we're too hands-off in our leadership capacities, we get consequential failures in terms of output and succession readiness. And there are a whole number of outcomes that come from this. And I'll just mention this as we kind of get into the tail end of this. I mean, I could have, I'm sure, continued to come up with further areas here, but you'll notice just at a cursory glance, almost every aspect of the business is impacted by successful leadership. From the attraction of talent, onboarding that talent successfully, ensuring that there's performance in role, ensuring that we're succession ready, ensuring that we are capable in the jobs that we perform and the outcomes that we expect from those results. Every one of those has a leadership component to it. And so if that's true, I'm just going to spend a minute talking about, well, how do we actually create those outcomes? What does competent leadership look like? What would I have to do to ensure that we are getting those sorts of engaged results from our team members? And this is going to be true regardless of what sort of leadership program you might look to bring in, whether that's created within the context of the organization itself, or whether you step outside and bring a leadership program in. There's certain core components that just simply need to be true. And they come down to being able to increase self-awareness of leaders. A good self-aware leader is foundational or fundamental to good overall leadership execution and leadership support. When we are unaware of the negative impact we have on others, we create a lot of collateral damage. So that self-awareness component, and then the behaviors necessary to be an effective leader, the things that good leaders do around people development, ultimately leading to a culture that says, hey, as a culture, we subscribe to the role that leaders play and the efficacy of good leadership here. So to get a little bit more in the weeds, at the end of this, I'm happy to make available to you this very simple leadership evaluation survey. It's 15 questions, and it just allows you to kind of gauge where would we lie in our current evaluation of our leadership approach here. Are we on one end of the spectrum? We need to be a little more thoughtful about how we think through leadership development, leadership execution, or maybe we're doing a bunch of things really, really well. It's very simple. It's not overly scientific, but it will give you a ground or a pathway to think through what may or may not be working and some of the areas that can be open for discussion in terms of how you think about leadership and the growth of your business through the lens of improved leader outcomes. So catch me at the end of this. I'm happy to send this. It's a simple PDF document, happy to make it available. Basically, in those three categories, leading of self or self-awareness, behaviors, and then culture, part of the leading authentically or creating self-awareness is I'm vulnerable as a leader. Again, I'm willing to raise a hand and say, I made a mistake. I don't have all the answers. It's an ongoing exercise of learning and development in this role. And that shifts the entire culture in terms of how we think about people development when we don't have to be perfect. We don't have all the answers. And we shift that mindset to one that is more centered around the development of people, not just the execution of function, but the development of people. To that end, one of the key parts of this is being able to develop trust in an organization. So how do you establish trust? Without the foundation of trust, everything else is on shaky ground. So one of the ways that we do this is by thinking through the component parts of trust. And trust, very simply put, and in a timely way, is a combination of authenticity, logic, or what I like to call competence, and empathy. So very simply, what we're really talking about here is are you authentic? Do I feel that when I'm dealing with you, I'm dealing with your authentic self? You're honest, you're forthright, you're transparent. Or do I always feel that there's just, there's a wall up, there's just something going on behind the scenes, and you're not very clear and transparent about how, what really goes on with you, what you really believe, and how those values play out in your behavior. The competence part of it is, I think, fundamental. It's hard to respect a leader and trust a leader if we feel like they're incompetent in their role, right? So there's a baseline of competence or logic that needs to be there. And then empathy is what most of us deal with, and from a most challenged standpoint. Are we legitimately concerned for the well-being, the development, and the ultimate success of the teams that we call our teams? These are our employees, our individuals. Are we really invested in their well-being, their support, their development? This can get, it sounds natural. We all say, well, of course I am. But when rubber meets road and we've got a mix of functional demands and people demands, are we there going the extra mile, serving that need to be the coach, the mentor, the developer of people, right? When those pieces are there, we create a baseline of trust. And from trust, we really get improved performance. So that leads into what are those performance characteristics that good leaders have. And just to boil this down, there's a couple of really simple things that good leaders have to do, irrespective of what market you're in, what role you have. If you have a title of leader, you're having to set priorities and create accountability. You're having to make sure that people know what it is they need to do, and you're keeping them accountable to do those things. You're setting a time aside to meet with them one-on-one. Individually, that might be only monthly, perhaps based on your work schedule and the busyness of your organization, but having that time to build a one-on-one relationship and to coach and mentor an individual changes the dynamic and allows trust to really to be established. And from trust, other component parts of growth and development to set in. Delegation. Are you doing things you shouldn't be doing that aren't appropriate to your level of leadership because you're not developing somebody else to take on those roles and be able to step in and do those things, right? So that's a developmental opportunity that also helps you to work at a higher level within the organization. So these are fundamental leadership components, what I like to call leadership behaviors that create really meaningful outcomes and start to become part of the culture. When we, as leaders, all of us agree that we're going to set priorities and create accountability. We're going to meet one-on-one with our direct reports. We're going to create a coaching and mentoring environment. We're going to delegate effectively. We're going to give performance feedback in reasonable and regular cadence. We do these things, we create a culture that reinforces that and attracts better levels of leaders for our organization because it's recognized. It's an organization that values leadership, so it attracts better leaders. And it really gets rid of folks who don't want to follow that model. So you start to get attrition from the right kind of attrition where folks aren't invested in that leadership activity. They don't feel like they belong here. It's not the right culture or right environment for them. And lastly, just in the waning minutes we've got, how do I synthesize all this? Well, you've got an increased number of challenges around just the attraction of talent. We've never had a more complex environment for talent attraction. We simply don't have enough people for all the available work that we've got. And within that, it's a complex stew, a multi-generational stew. What stands out in terms of an attraction strategy, though, when you look at engagement numbers, is the more investment we make in leadership development and active development of our people, the better our engagement numbers, the better our financial outcomes, whether it's the profitability, whether it's our operational effectiveness, a retention, or a drop in attrition numbers. Right, we're getting better outcomes. So the more that we invest in core leadership activities, the better our business health really gets from that, and the better we get at attracting, retaining talent, which helps support that growth and stability for organization long term. So I know this is a lot of content. I know I'm talking a mile a minute. What I hope is that you heard something here that sparked your interest. If nothing else, I'm happy to send you a copy of that survey allow you to look at that and maybe use that to kind of model or think about some mapping of leadership within your organization. But I'm always happy to talk to any one of you. I'm a beer drinker at heart. My favorite beverages. So I'm here to help, and I would love nothing more to connect and follow up on a conversation specific to your organization, some of the challenges you're having. So please let me know how I can best do that. And again, thank you. Appreciate you coming to the session and spending some time with me. So thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this session, we'd love to see you in real life. We host in-person workshops across the country for craft beer professionals just like you that are held in some of the most exciting beer destinations around. These immersive events are designed to help you grow and connect with others. You'll meet peers from across the country and leave with actionable strategies for success. Connection has never been more important, and you can learn more at cbpconnects.com. Cheers. See you there.